Thank you so much for coming today to this fantastic talk. On behalf of the e-Luminate team, I really want to thank you for being here. We're also really delighted to say that the festival is going so well, and we really are thankful for your support. It's my esteemed pleasure to introduce Professor Douglas Crawford Brown, who we also feel very grateful to be a member of the festival and to be a member on our board. So thank you very much, and without further ado, here you go.
Okay. So maybe 30 minutes, something along that line. I appreciate the people showing up. I know all of you actually wanted to be in on the EDL march today. Good. Well done. Okay, so I've called this specifically turning down the lights so the poor can turn theirs up. This is not a doom and gloom climate talk. I'm in fact going to talk very little bit about climate change at all, and actually very little about lights. Okay, and the poor only make an appearance every once in a while. Okay? But you'll see there's a sort of a theme to what I'm going to be talking about here. I'll start by saying that the reason I agreed to give the talk was we are running something called Cambridge Retrofit. It is to make the city of Cambridge the first city to hit the 80% reduction in carbon dioxide. It's going to be on my one slide. Oh, excuse me a second. Somehow, apply to all slides. That's the apply to all slides. Off we go again. And in Cambridge Retrofit, this is a retrofit of existing buildings. If you ask who is Cambridge Retrofit, well, it certainly is myself, it's the City Council and so forth, but more importantly, it's Bidwells, it's Savills, it's Royal Bank of Scotland, it's Skanska, it's AECOM, it's DEC, it's the Treasury, it's English Heritage, and on and on. It is a truly public-private enterprise to try to bring forward energy reduction measures throughout the city of Cambridge. And we'll see what light and modern homes may have to do with this. This is a typical bar graph that you'll see. This is the only bar graph that you're going to see here. It's the only thing with numbers in it. It is a chart of how much carbon dioxide is coming out of different parts of the city. University of Cambridge, the colleges, the residential sector, our houses, the commercial and business sector, the government buildings, transport, waste, and then this is the total right here. But the main thing to look at is simply that residential and commercial are by far the dominant forces in carbon dioxide, and of those sectors, about 16 to 55% of their carbon dioxide is down to lighting. Now, having said that, this talk is not actually about lighting. Okay? Although you'll see light actually weaves its way throughout everything that I'm going to talk about. Now, when I say it's not about lighting, what I mean is it's not about light bulbs per se. I've put David Mackay's picture up here. David, as you probably know, is a very good speaker on this topic. He's a professor in the physics department. Not more importantly, equally importantly, he's the chief science advisor for Department of Energy and Climate Change. And David measures every bit of energy use in terms of light bulbs. So he asks you if you run your car, if you turn on your washing machine, and so forth, how many equivalents of that is turning on light bulbs? So a typical talk like this might actually go back to this slide, look at the emissions, talk about it in terms of numbers of light bulbs, and then try to get you to think in terms of the fact that if you use a compact fluorescent light bulb like this one, you get the same amount of light, and we'll come back to that in just a bit, as this amount of incandescent light bulbs. Now, having said that, when the power heating system, went out at our house this winter, I took all the compact fluorescent light bulbs out and put in our old incandescent light bulbs. Any idea why? They give off heat. You can actually heat a room with an incandescent light bulb, as I found. I had big 100-watt incandescent light bulbs in the ceiling plates. Okay, but having said that, this is not a talk about the technologies of light bulbs. I think we all get this message, right? We all get the idea that carbon dioxide emissions require a reduction of energy use, that has something to do with lighting, so we all run and we buy compact fluorescent light bulbs. Well, the EU says we will all go run and buy compact fluorescent light bulbs, and I think we get that picture. I'm going to do a slightly different image here, slightly different talk, which is to recognize that, now I'm a physicist, so by God, you're going to get a physics slide in here. Okay? This is the electromagnetic spectrum, all the way from cosmic rays up to radio waves. And to a physicist, light is nothing special. I mean, light is something that we use to see by, but there are plenty of other species, including Predator, Arnold Schwarzenegger movie, that see by other wavelengths. And most of the stuff I'm going to talk about, in fact, is going to be taking place at many of these other wavelengths. Okay, so when I talk about light, turning off light in order to allow the poor nations to turn on light, I'm actually going to mean something about any of those things you see up there, which just happens to be the sort of Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, when we think about light in light bulbs. But I'm not going to restrict myself to that, otherwise the talk ends right now. Because there's nothing else to say about the visible light side of things. This is what I grew up on. This is what I was told in 1957 when I was watching these cartoons. This is what I was told I would be doing in the year 2000. This is what my life would be. I've been cheated. I don't have robots. I don't have jetpacks. I'm not living in houses built on stilts flying in space and so forth. But this was the vision of what things were going to be like with all of these technologies that I'm going to talk about in a moment available. Now this is, of course, an American cartoon, so everybody's got really good teeth and they're smiling and happy and, oblivious to the problems outside, but very, very smiling and happy here. Okay? So this was the Jetsons' vision of what my life was supposed to be like right now. But the other vision that I was given was the Flintstones. Okay? Now, we could make an argument that if we're going to go back to not much energy use, very low use of lights in our homes and so forth, we're going back into the cave age. Our life is going to be horrible. It's going to be terrible. And what I want to point out here is that the Flintstones are, as far as I can tell, about as happy as the Jetsons. Okay? They're not so far off in terms of the Jetsons. And you never see a cartoon in which Fred or somebody is saying, you know what, this is awful. I wish I had a 50-inch plasma screen television. This is unbearable. Okay? They've got other ways in which they meet those needs. And so we're going to come back to that theme in just a bit. People living lives which may be vastly different. That couldn't be more different to this one right here. But as far as humans are concerned, as far as the humanness of living, I would say they're not necessarily any more happy than they are. Again, I'm not going to propose that we all ought to be pushing our cars with our feet. I have seen that. I ran a program for a while in Cuba for the United States, for a U.S. university, and the Cubans, God bless them, thanks to the American embargo, the guys, because it's almost always guys that are doing this, they have cars from the 1950s and 1960s. Not one of them runs, okay? But one guy will get in the car, and the others will push it, and the guy will drive right proudly down the street, and then they have a little squabble, and then he has to get out, and the next one gets in, and they drive for a while. Okay? They're just as happy as can be with their cars, though. Okay, now, what has made the difference between the Jetsons and the Flintstones, or really the other way around, between the Flintstones and the Jetsons, is what I'm going to call here, and which you'll have seen in the news as the world brain. Right? This is sort of an H.G. Wells kind of idea that eventually we would be all interconnected in some way with our technologies. And it's referred to as the world brain. And Google is the exemplification of this, right? If you ever go to Google, and it's a really cool set of campuses that they have, a little frightening in their vision, but really kind of cool because they all believe that what they're doing is they're creating the world brain. They're connecting everything together. Now, this caused big problems for them when the world brain ended up involving Google Books and lots of squabbles over the Google Books fiasco. But this is the idea of the world brain. And part of what I'm going to be talking about here is that our houses are going to, in your lifetime, well, I'll go with the demographics down front more than I will the demographics up here on stage or whatever. But within your lifetime, our houses will be part of the world brain. And they already kind of are, aren't they? Okay? Particularly if you've had the disadvantage of ever going on to 4chan. And if you know what 4chan is, well, shame on you. Okay? If you don't, you've actually got a life. Okay, well done. Okay, so this is the world brain. And what's happened in the world brain is that cities are beginning to connect together all the buildings in them by this sort of flow of information. Now, what I want to argue here is, no, argue is the wrong phrase. What I want to claim here is that it has been the reduction of physical things that we would normally do using physical objects, the reduction of that into information, and then the putting out and making use of information as the basis of our lives and our economy and so forth, which is actually the big difference between the Jetsons and the Flintstones, and will tell us something about the way our houses are going to be functioning. So what I want you to start doing is getting a bit of a picture where he talked earlier about the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, and now suddenly he's talking about information. How do we transmit information? Well, at the moment, we transmit it on electromagnetic waves, right? Our mobile and so forth. Right? So bound up in our homes, bound up in the leading of our lives in the future, is going to be this increasing interconnectedness of things and using the medium of electromagnetic radiation with information flowing. And that's actually what the theme of my talk is. And my argument is that while that has some problems, the more we buy into that, the more we're going to be able to turn off our energy consumption in the Western world or in the developed world and allow the developing nations to begin to get at that information, that energy. And we'll see why in just a minute. This is the classic economic world pyramid. Okay? We're up at the top up there with mature markets making more than $20,000 per person per year for people. But the vast majority of people live down here at the base of the pyramid or the bottom of the pyramid. Right? And they are, unlike the image of the Flintstones, they are not living this kind of idyllic life where they're perfectly happy and they don't need the 50-inch plasma screen television. They don't need the 50-inch plasma screen television. They're living in sort of crushing poverty. Right? There's nothing noble about it, nothing desirable about it. If we could lift them up out of that, that would be a completely good thing. Now, how we lift them up in a way that doesn't put them on the path that got us to the top of the pyramid is the whole challenge in sort of the climate and energy sphere. And so we'll see how that's going to play itself out in just a moment. So, if I didn't run into a copyright dispute, I would have the Nike logo up here. And the reason is I worked with a firm called Wieden & Kennedy for a while. I mean, not one of their employees. What I did was I went to their world offices and I wired up their offices so that they could see what their energy use was. Wieden & Kennedy is the ones who are the ones, Wieden & Kennedy as a company is the one that created the Just Do It campaign. Okay? So they're associated with Nike. Now, why did Wieden & Kennedy want to reduce its energy use? Yes, they wanted to reduce the bills in Wieden & Kennedy, the energy bills, but they didn't take the savings that they generated and plow it back into the profit. They bought with that savings solar panels and brought those solar panels to schools all over Africa, to villages that couldn't afford to bring power into the schools. And you can look at this picture and you can say, well, that's horrible. Now you've got villages that are suddenly using energy when they weren't using energy before. But for these people in this village, and particularly for the kids who are in the schools, this was a big issue, to be able to have this kind of power. The amount of power that this thing generated for this school is, it's 1/20th the amount of energy that the average UK student will use during a school hour. But it's enough for them to do what they want to do. This idea comes out ultimately from Amory Lovins. Okay, so this is Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute in the United States. I asked him once, and he told me what the banana thing was, and I don't remember what it was, but I remember when he told me it didn't make any sense. I didn't understand why the banana was in there. Okay? But he's standing in front of the solar panel. Now, what Amory introduced was the idea of asking why you're using energy, why are you using materials? And what he argues, and he doesn't use this slide, but I'm going to use this slide. What he argues is that the signifier keeps pushing in front of the signified. Now, this is Magritte saying that this is not a pipe. Don't confuse this with a pipe. I know it looks like a pipe, but it's not a pipe. He says the picture of the pipe is the signifier. The thing that's signified is the actual pipe itself. Now, what Amory Lovins argues is that we get confused between signifiers and signified. And what he says is, you want to see you in a room. You take that to mean, I'm going to turn the lights on. But what you could do is you could build bigger windows and go sit by the window. Right? And Amory says we get ourselves caught in this pattern of thinking that the way we satisfy what is really our underlying desire, which is to be able to see, we satisfy it by the signifier or the turning on the lights. And so what he asks everybody to do is to step back and ask, what is it that you really wanted? And then, is it absolutely necessary that you meet that want by turning on the heating system or putting on lights or so forth? Could you, for example, just put on a jumper, okay, instead of turning up the heat in the house? Okay, this one I have to give you. Whoever I was speaking to earlier, you're going to get the answer. So who is this? I give you a hint. Potential third Oscar. You're not American. This is Abraham Lincoln, right? And in American mythology, or whatever you want to call it, Abraham Lincoln grew up in a log cabin, and there were no real windows in the log cabin because people really didn't have glass at that time. And so he would do all his reading next to the firelight. Right? And so for Abraham Lincoln, what is light? Well, yes, light is sort of heat and so forth, but light is education, right? Light is the ability of Abraham Lincoln to read at night, right? And this is really heavily built into, like I say, American mythology. You know, by God, if Abraham Lincoln can do his schoolwork, you know, by the firelight, you can do it, you know, for your third grade assignment. Let's continue with the light theme. Okay, and we've wandered a little far away from climate change stuff, but that's okay. My argument is still that it's all connected together. King's College Chapel, when this was built, the belief in the Middle Ages was that light coming through this kind of glass would carry knowledge with it. Right? I mean, the pictures were not just up there as a kind of book that you could read by looking up at it. In medieval science, the belief was light carried knowledge. And there was a really classic demonstration that was done by professors around here at that time, which is we would put big curtains across the windows here, and you couldn't see me, and I would say, how many fingers do I have up? Okay? I can't see you, Professor. You know, it's too dark in here. And the professor would fling open the windows with the curtains and say, how many fingers do I have up? You've got 2 up. And the argument was, well, what's the only thing that's changed? The only thing that's changed is the presence of light. And so the argument was, light carries knowledge. In fact, what they thought was it was sort of coming from the heavens down through these windows and then into you. So light is a kind of a knowledge carrier, and in the medieval period, right? And there are other things that one can begin to do with light passing through color glass and so forth. So this is the polysolar material. Right? And now light passing down through the polysolar material is actually producing power and producing electricity through it. So there's a kind of a capture of something with light passing down through pieces of glass that have solar PV built into them. We'll come back to that in just a bit. Okay? Now, how would this all work? How would we get to a point where people in the developed world are using a lot less energy? They're able to send that energy off into the developing world. We're able to use light and so forth and other wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum in driving the changes that we're interested in. And if you've dealt much with sort of climate change actions, you'll know that one of the central visions is the idea of dematerializing our life. In fact, Julian Allwood in the Department of Engineering here, along with Ray Barker, thanking him for starting this center, but Julian Allwood's argument is that we're focused way too much on energy as the climate problem, that what we should be focusing on is dematerializing our lives. And that in the process of dematerializing our lives, we will start to move naturally towards lower energy, because most of the energy goes into the production of materials and the operation of materials. Now, he's not using a message of, well, just stop buying stuff. Just stop having stuff in your home. Let's go back to a cave existence and you just don't have sofas and so forth. What he's arguing is very much an Amory Lovins kind of argument, which is ask yourself what you actually want in life, and is there any way that you could reach that thing that you want without quite as much material goods? And we'll see examples of that in just a bit, in which we are, as a society, beginning to dematerialize our lives in some pretty significant ways, and I've already mentioned some of them here. This was what I was promised when I was a kid. Okay? I would have a light beam that I would shine at my television, and I wouldn't have to get up and go turn the channel. Does anybody remember actually getting up and turning channels? Well done. Remember when we used to have, this is a Stuart Lee routine, remember when we used to have real things, physical things you could touch and so on? You used to get up and turn the channel, right? And the ultimate control of a parent was sending the kid across the room to do it. I grew up with, Doug, go put on channel 3. It was never go put on channel 42, because I worked with 3 channels to go turn. Go put on channel 3. Well, this thing was, let's actually control this thing over here with light. And the idea was it will be light. Now, we could say, well, that's silly. Of course, we don't have a structure in our home where we control things by these light beams. But of course we do. It turns out that it's not light that's used by this thing. It's other frequencies of this electromagnetic spectrum. But it's the same sort of thing, right? One of the first steps forward in which our houses are replacing things that we do with things that send information over to other things. And that's another theme that I'm going to be building on here. Things that send information over to other things, and in the process of doing that, dematerialize things, require it to be less material intensive than it was in the past. And what we're moving towards in our home, and this will certainly be, I even think for everybody in here in your lifetime, I've already got it in my house, everything in the house will be controlled by this system. So it's not just, I don't know, Sky TV and you've got 400 channels of things that you don't want to watch. Okay? I'm just stunned by how many bad channels there are out there. Okay? It will be other things. The lights in your house, the heating in the house, the water coming out of the tap and so forth, all controlled by this kind of a system. Now, if you're an engineer, this is really desirable, because if you can control it by information, you can start to think about optimizing the system. And you can start to think about how you can get your system to deliver all the things that you really wanted, right? You don't want light bulbs. What you want is light. And the system can potentially control that in such a way that you get your values met, your desires met in an optimal way. Now, I'm not a hardcore technologist, okay? There are things we'll see in just a minute that lead us in the opposite direction. And this is, I had some of these on the other day, and they were both really cool and really creepy. These are Google glasses. Right? And I used to see these at MIT. 20 years ago in MIT, there were students walking around with these kinds of glasses. And you'd see them, and they were bumping into walls and so forth. But whatever are you doing? And they were watching computer screens on one of their glasses 20 years ago. And this was going to be the wave of the future, the MIT Design Lab. Well, the way the Google glasses work, of course, is you have that little projector up there, and it puts the image onto your eyeball. Now, the reason that I'm giving you this is not the idea that, oh, that's quite cool, Google glasses. I can walk around and never, ever have to talk to another person on the street again. Okay? I can just interact with the world brain, where I can be whatever I want to. Okay? The reason I'm showing you this is that if you want information about temperature and so forth, this system right here uses a minuscule amount of energy to project that information onto your eyeball. A minuscule amount compared to what a thermometer would take, for example, in order to provide you that same information. This is an example of a technology that gets you the need that you want, which is to know what the temperature was. I suppose you could also simply hold your hand up and feel what the temperature is, but it gets you that information by disembodying the idea of a thermometer and so forth, and projecting it onto your eyeball. Now, there's a classic example of, and I'm not going to show it to you here because the picture would be too rude, there's a classic example of Gregory Bateson, the anthropology sort of guru, who back in the 1970s invented a light bulb that emitted light at exactly the wavelength that human skin absorbed at. Now that was interesting. You could put a 100-watt light bulb in your room and you could produce warmth in you, the feeling of warmth and the actual warmth. There was a trick to it, though, which is it didn't go through clothing. So you had to be naked for it. And the other problem was that it only absorbed at the wavelength of, that wavelength was only absorbed by human skin. Those chairs did not absorb at that wavelength. So everything you sat on was whatever room temperature was outside. But the idea that Bateson had was, now being an anthropologist, he thought we could get over any sort of social taboo. Okay. The idea Bateson had was, I can heat you in your house at 1/10, 1/20th the amount of energy that it's going to take to pump hot air into your room. Now, if you're an engineer or a physicist, you'll know that 96% of the molecules that we heat up in the air in a house never touch your skin and never produce any heat in you. They are eventually going to go right out the window. Only about 4% of that heat is actually captured by your body. Right? And what Bateson is saying is, let's get rid of this problem of 96% being lost. Okay? In a Google Glasses kind of a world. I said there are downsides, and there are, if you're a science fiction fan, there are all sorts of implications of whether that becomes Borgs from Star Trek. Okay? So there are all sorts of sociological issues about the pathway that we're heading down when people are increasingly connected to this world brain, and when their whole identity and their whole way of interacting with the world is through that world brain. Okay? I mean, it's already said by people who work in this field, and I think they're right, that probably your online internet persona is the one that you're most known by in the world. To me, that's a little bit frightening, because somebody could be a 6-year-old schoolgirl, they could be, the same person online could be a 58-year-old prison occupant somewhere. Okay, so there are issues having to do with moving down this pathway. Now, technologically, this is what's happening in our homes. I'm not going to go through all these. I am going to look at these two things right here. Energy-efficient lighting and demand response appliances. Now, I'm not going to go into what a demand response appliance is in any detail, but power companies would love to have every appliance in your house talking to them through the world brain, and with the power company talking back. In the power company's ideal world, the power company says to the refrigerator, turn yourself off for the next 2 hours. They don't phone you up and ask you to do it. Go turn the refrigerator down. They talk directly to the refrigerator. Now, why do they want to do this? This is not a big brother evil conspiracy, although it could be. Yeah, it could be. Who knows? But I don't think it is. Instead, what they want to do is they want to connect together everything via this world brain, by this transfer of information. They want to connect together your house with businesses, with cars, and so forth. Now, the reason that they want to do this is this right here. So I spend time with the National Grid going into their main control center. Right? And in the main control center, it's like a train control center or something like that. Big screens. Sorry, I'm wandering out of view over there. You need to put an X here for me. Okay? They have people in there, at any time that I've seen, who are watching television. They're watching television. I don't mean they're watching a television screen that's looking at the power system. They're watching television. So what are they doing?
See when there's a break.
Because
everyone makes tea.
Everybody makes tea. They're looking for something that's about to happen in television world that's going to cause people to go open the refrigerator doors with compressors kicking in, putting on the kettle, and so forth. The reason that they do that is throughout the day we consume very different amounts of energy. Okay? You get up in the morning, you're not consuming much energy. Around 6 or so, 7, you get ready to go to work. You go off to work, unless you're French, in which case up here. Okay? And then around 6 or 7, you start coming back down again, okay, because you're coming home from work, unless you're French, which was back up here. That's all. I'm English enough to have picked up that trait. Okay, so now, the question is, what do you do when these big peaks start occurring? Well, in order to feed a peak, you can't just start a whole power plant up and then shut the power plant down. Power plants take a lot of lead time to raise them up and bring them back down again. So what you do is, and this is not fair because this is not in fact a diesel engine, but you have these sorts of engines that you can turn on very quickly and turn off very quickly. I mean, Rolls-Royce makes most of its money, I think from the books I've seen, selling these kinds of things. Engines that could function as an airplane engine, which have the characteristic that you can crank them up really quickly, start generating power when everybody's off getting their tea kettle on, and then when the halftime is over and everybody's back settled in front of the TV again, you can turn these things off. Okay? Now, so you could keep meeting that peak by these kinds of things. The problem is these are very inefficient engines. Okay? It's a lot more efficient to run an engine flat out, constantly, than having to crank them up and bring them back down again. Okay? And so what they're interested in linking your house to your car and so forth, to your appliances, they're interested in load leveling. Amount of energy being used, and what they'd like to do is they'd like to raise this stuff up and store that energy somewhere. In the state of Florida, they have a project with Disney World in which they store the excess electricity in car batteries in a fully electric battery fleet. And then whenever they start to get to the peak load time, signals go out to all the cars, and the car tells the driver, you need to pull over and you need to plug in. And that then shaves off the peak generation. And they get a very flat profile there. So from the power company's perspective, this is really a dream to be able to do that. Okay? They'd like to have that peak, that flat level go up and up and up and up and up. On the climate change side, I don't want it going up and up and up, but I like the idea of flattening. But that's only possible if things are communicating, and the only way you're going to make them communicate is through this sort of world brain, and through things like this. So this is Geo from a local Cambridge company, right? And they have monitors that they will place in your home, and those monitors will tell you at any given moment in time how much power you're consuming, how much natural gas you're consuming, how much CO2 you're producing, and so forth. And ultimately, you can connect this thing up to the world brain, and you can receive on your mobile phone the information from here, and you could be at work and your home is ringing you up, or on a text message, and saying, tell me when you're going to be home, right? Because I'll start the heating system up. I've turned it off now, but I'm going to start the heating system up a half hour before you get there, and I'll shut it back after you've left. And so Geo's got a right sort of idea. This raises interesting sociological questions for us. The automated home of tomorrow can be hacked into. If everything is going through the world brain, people will hack into it. Okay? Any 8-year-old knows how to hack through any system. Okay? They're extraordinarily good at it. And imagine having your house under the control of your petulant 8-year-old who's going to hack in, and while you're trying to have a dinner party, send rude pictures over the TV or something like that. Okay? Or turning the heat on up in mom and dad's bedroom, and so forth. Right? So cybersecurity of this is really quite potentially problematic. Now, we're about at the end here. As part of Cambridge Retrofit, we are doing a retrofit of the university library. Okay? I've chosen this image for several reasons. One is it's the university library. Okay? One is it's not a bad image. One is in order to make this space habitable at all, there are lots of lights in here, thousands of watts worth of lights in this room. And I've also chosen this image because there's just the one woman there. I don't mean it's the woman that matters. It's the fact that there's one person there in the room. Now, when I first started coming to Cambridge, which was in 1982, or some of you were born, okay, not all yet, in 1982, the university library had a constant flow of people through the front door. Here comes a person, here comes a person, here comes a person, right? And this room would be filled up with people. We're doing the retrofit study right now, and the number of people that come into the university library is 5% of what it used to be. 5%. Okay? And you could bemoan that and say, well, isn't that awful? People aren't going to libraries anymore. But the fact is they are still going to libraries. It's just this is their library. Right? And the amount of energy that it takes to run this thing right here so that a bunch of kids are able to get at these documents is minuscule compared to what it takes to run the university library. And the difference is the materialization, right? Essentially what you're looking at here is a picture of dematerializing a physical library into a virtual kind of a space. And again, we can bemoan that. We can say, well, the nice thing about libraries used to be that you met all sorts of people there and you went down for tea and so forth, and it was a lovely setting. And so the social side of me really likes that. But the climate change side of me sort of applauds this and says, well, you know, this is a lot less energy to do the same thing, which was to get people the knowledge that was in the books. Now, it doesn't mean that the library was only about getting knowledge out of books. As I mentioned, a library is also about socializing. It's also about nice architecture and so forth. But at least as far as the aim of getting knowledge, this works just fine. Okay? And I'm going to end with these last couple of images. It's an image of a home that has been dematerialized. This is a sort of minimalist aesthetic. So this could be Denmark, the whole country of Denmark. Okay? It's a minimalist kind of idea. It's the smallest amount of materials that you could have. My son and his wife decided they wanted to have their house in Cambridge being minimalist. They didn't quite understand minimalism. What they thought was they'd buy a bunch of furniture that was in black and white, but they still bought as much furniture as anybody would in the Victorian period and plugged it in. Minimalism really is about dematerializing the house that you're in. And I have friends now, well, I'll use myself. We had about 4,000 records with a big turntable and speakers and so forth. Against my better judgment, but I let him do it, my son took every one of those records and all of our CDs and put them onto our computer, and we now have a system called Sonos, and I sit there with this thing, and I have access to, first, 100,000 radio stations around the world. 100,000 radio stations. And I have all 4,000 of those records that I can pull up at any given moment in time and play over the system. I have dematerialized the act of getting music into my house. Right? Now, minimalism has its downsides. This is a classic scene from Sleeper. I love it. I don't care whether you are laugh at it at all. I love it. Okay? This is Woody Allen. He goes into a minimalist house. In Sleeper, he's woken up 300 years later, and the world is a very sort of different world. He goes into this house, and this is the chair that they've got for him to sit on. It's just a really minimal, thin piece of sculpture. You don't see it here, but he tumbles off of it all the time while he's trying to sit. So minimalism has these issues about whether the amount of material that you've got in the house is actually enough for you to really lead a sort of humane life, but still it dematerializes it. But there are these problems. This is a hotel room, and this is what any hotel owner will tell you they want that room to look like. Lots of light, and lots of that color of light. People instinctively respond to goldish hues of light as being more comforting, of being warmer. My mother would never go into a room that had fluorescent lighting in it while she was alive. She hated it. She hated it. She said it felt like she was in a sci-fi movie. She said it made her look awful. Made her look awful. Well, we Crawfords don't look that good to begin with. And so, she liked yellow light. There's no doubt that the light that is high efficiency is a different sort of light. LEDs give off a different sort of light. Okay? This room actually has plenty of light in it. It's of an LED that happens to be the cheapest kind of LED you can buy, which it gives a bit of a bluish hue to things. Okay? And so there are these social issues about how far we can move towards light that has the characteristics that we want without inducing this. This is not my mom. This is whatever you get when you Google in pictures of distraught women. It's the first sort of image. I love Googling in these sorts of things. Images of, and see what you get. You get all sorts of odd stuff. Okay, so this is a woman who just simply isn't feeling, I have no idea why she's doing this, and I hope to God it's not because something horrible has in fact happened in her life somewhere. Okay, but at least for my story here, it's, she's been forced to live in this room. Okay, but she wanted that room. Okay, last two slides. So the whole thing that we're talking about here, the whole sort of theme is dematerializing through the use of information, the connection together of our appliances, our phones, our cars, and so forth, our power stations, turning down the energy that we use here in the West, or in the developed world, so that this kid gets to have more energy at the bottom of the pyramid. It struck me when I looked at this figure here, this picture here, which also is what you get when you first Google in pictures of hands turning down thermostats. Okay? Now what's interesting is I actually typed in turning down thermostats. I look at this, and I don't know, is it just me, or does anybody else feel that this person's actually turning up the thermostat? It just feels like turning up the thermostat. But that's okay, because what I could say is, I meant to choose that, because we want to turn it down so that the developing world can turn it up. I'm sticking to that story. Okay, it's not the actual story, but, okay. And so I'm going to end with that. Okay. I spent 15 minutes, more time than I ever should have, trying to get exactly a gradation where it's going down in color. Okay? I hope it was to amazing effect here. Okay, so thanks very much. We do have time for a few questions, but that involves raising physical hands.
Thanks. That's very interesting. You described the MIT glasses as creepy. Kind of interested in why you had that experience and what you think the future holds for that technology.
Well, remember that that picture I showed you was Google Glasses, right? And if you looked at somebody with Google Glasses on, you wouldn't necessarily know they were wearing Google Glasses, right? Because everybody wears, people who are between the ages of about 20 and 30, they all seem to buy the same set of glasses. That's a plastic frame to the side, a black part, a yellow part underneath it, and so forth. And Google has designed itself so it's very non-intrusive in that. In the old MIT ones, these were old LaForge in, what was he in? Was he Star Trek also? The guy with the big glasses, he didn't really have eyes, he saw through them. I mean, these were big, clunky things, and you looked like a machine when you were walking around with it. And as I mentioned, they weren't quite transparent enough, and so people were bumping into things. Right? So you'd walk down the hall, and one of these cyber geeks they were referred to as, they would come walking towards you, and you sort of stood against the wall because you knew there was a 50% chance they were just going to plow right into you, because they were actually off watching, well, God knows what. They weren't in that room. Now, I mean, that whole thing, we could have a whole talk about people no longer being there anymore. Right? So, for example, I gave this summer program down in right outside of Paris, and we had a thing called the Commons Room there. And I never went into the and it was always filled with students, always filled. I never went into the Commons Room in which there were two people talking to each other. They were all, and I call that being there without being there. Okay, we're increasingly not where we are. We're physically there, but we're actually emotionally and so forth someplace else. And that is kind of a trend that I do worry about a bit. But having said that, I suspect we'll simply adapt as a species, and we'll turn that into something positive. I can't think of what that would be at the moment. And again, I have this image of Borgs connected together. Because again, the issue is, if you are connected to this world brain, then you are part of a larger collective. And anybody who's in Anonymous, for example, or something like that, I won't pressure you here, because you don't want a lawsuit or to have WikiLeaks come after you. People in Anonymous actually often like that sort of collectivist hive kind of an experience, and feel that this is actually the future of where humanity is going to go. They don't see it as a bad thing, they see it as a good thing. Brains kind of connected together, wired together in some way. To somebody who was brought up on science fiction, to me, I see nothing but bad signs from that. But that could just be because the signifiers that I use are not the signifiers people use these days.
Yeah, aren't you just displacing a lot of power consumption onto computer servers?
Well, yeah. There's no doubt that you are displacing some power consumption onto computer servers. So if everybody in here knows the story of doing Google searches, and X number of Google searches, 3, 4, 5, depending on how you do the calculation, being the equivalent to the amount of energy it takes to heat a cup of tea. And we had at the University of North Carolina, in case you didn't notice, you thought I was from Glasgow, but I'm not. I'm from the United States, and I was dean of a school of environment there, and we had a Google farm there. Right? This Google farm had to have its own power station built, a 30-megawatt power station. Google farms consume a lot of energy. So if, when I ran the numbers, I found that you were in fact consuming more energy running the computer kinds of things than would have taken place if you hadn't used the computer stuff at all, then I would be very much against this. David Mackay has the phrase of run the numbers. He also says no more adjectives, right? And what he means by run the numbers is we often really fool ourselves about what's good and what's bad. So, for example, should I have had this PowerPoint presentation up, or should I have printed for everybody these slides and handed them to you? And our natural inclination might be to say, well, I'm not sure where you would go with this. Oh, no, you've got a big light bulb going on. You didn't need a light bulb if you printed out. Oh, no, you've got a printer that's going now, and there's all the paper that was consumed and all the ink and so forth. When you run the numbers, what you find is they are within the margins of errors, they're the same. Okay? And yet, I think most of us would have a sort of gut instinct, probably completely inconsistent amongst us here, as to which one was in fact the better of the two options. So I haven't run the numbers on this. It's a perfectly good question, though, which is, are you sure that when you do that, you aren't causing something else? I often in these presentations have a slide of St. Bernard. Right? St. Bernard said almost 1,000 years ago, hell is filled with good intentions and desires.
Could you say a few words about the relationship between energy efficiency and affordability? Because energy efficiency doesn't mean that it's going to get cheaper, and more and more people can't afford the energy for what we call daily lives.
So, Also, in other variants of this talk, I have the hierarchy of energy, right? And the of energy solutions. And the hierarchy is supposed to be, first, don't use the energy in the first place. You know, if you could put on a jumper and not have to turn the heat up, and you're just as comfortable with the jumper on as you would have been with the heat turned up, well, do that. You know, unless, of course, it turns out it's going to take more energy and carbon to make the jumper than you'll ever save with the heating, but that's not the case here. So that's the first one, right? The next one is, whatever energy you're using, use it the most efficiently possible. The third one is, whatever energy you still need, generate it with low carbon. Now, at least for the latter two, there is a legitimate argument that it is possible that the cost of the energy efficiency is going to be out of range for a significant portion of the population. It could be, right? It could be. There's a reason that businesses are going towards this, which is that when they run the numbers, they find that they can, in fact, pay back within 2 to 3 years on many of the measures. In Cambridge retrofit, though, what we find is you will never pay back on the savings of operation and maintenance, on the savings of energy costs. You will never pay back a really deep retrofit of a building, the deep retrofits that we want. And so in Cambridge retrofit, how do we deal with that? We deal with it by linking retrofits to refurbs and increased asset values of buildings. And what we find is that you're simply not going to get there on the basis of energy savings. Now, you've raised the issue of sort of energy poverty, which I'll expand fuel poverty up into energy poverty. We do have a significant number of people who simply can't afford the bills that they've got right now. And so you end up with government programs that have somebody else pay for the energy efficiency so that you're able to get the benefits of that energy efficiency. But of course, somebody is paying for it somewhere, right? No such thing as a free lunch in this regard. So, yeah, I mean, it is so context specific that I wouldn't want to give a single answer, but you're absolutely right that these are exactly the sorts of questions people have got to ask, because, again, hell is filled with good intentions and desires. There are lots of things that we think are quite good. We drive down energy in Cambridge by Cambridge retrofit. We drive down CO2 in Cambridge by Cambridge retrofit. The world price of oil goes down. Not enough, we're too small of a nation for that to happen, but you know, if everybody did it in the developed world, the world price of oil goes down. India and China can now afford to get at oil they couldn't afford to get at before. They burn it in a lot less efficient equipment than we would here, and the world's CO2 emissions go up. Right? We find lots of these leakage problems around where people think they're doing something that's good, but the actual impact on the world sends the emissions up. And it's one of the explanations why, when I wake up at 3 in the morning, I never think about climate change. Right? You don't think about your bank account. You don't think about your failing love affair. Well, not in my case. I've been married 42 years. So, right? I go downstairs and I put on, I don't know, a Stuart Lee episode or something like that, because you don't want to think about climate change at 3 in the morning when your biological clock is at its ebb. Because if you look at the information about climate change, nothing is going in a direction that makes you think we've got this well sorted. You know, the emissions are just going up and up and up faster than we ever would have guessed that they're going up. And many times they're going up because of things we did for good reasons. The UK has not reduced its emissions. It has not. If you take into account the carbon dioxide embodied in the goods that we sent off to China to be manufactured, we've actually gone up in emissions. But we don't talk about that. There's only one major world economy that has reduced its emissions even when you take into account consumption, and you'll never guess it because it's a trick, because the state of California by itself would be one of the top 10 world economies if it's separated off as a nation. And it is the only economy that has actually gone down in CO2 emissions, even by consumption-based accounting. Once you correct for recession effects, right? It doesn't count that there's a recession and we just stop consuming for a while, because it will come back with a vengeance later. And I know English audiences love to be lectured to by Americans about American successes. It could be better. I could be French.
There's nothing wrong to be French.
Well, we lived for years in Paris, and we love French. But because Eddie Izzard picked on it for a bit, I have to pick on it. It's an easy joke. Okay?
It's an English thing.
It's an English thing. Yeah. And in 3 weeks, it will be an English thing for me when I go for my citizenship exam. That's it.
Do we have any other questions? Great. Please join. Yes.
Okay.
We have built a world completely inefficient in the last 60 years. So we are talking about the future, but what about our past industrial world? What about the issues?
Well, first I'll say, Cambridge retrofit is all about the past, right? It's called retrofit for a reason. We don't deal with new buildings. Secondly, I'll say, I think you're right about this, we will not build our way out of this problem. Now, what I mean by that is, if we build more energy efficient houses, we will simply have more houses piled on top of the ones that we currently have. If when somebody built out Trumpington Road, they built whatever those things are out there, Great Knighton or whatever it's called, if when they built that, they came and knocked down my house on Portugal Place, okay, well then that would be an energy savings, wouldn't it? Because my house on Portugal Place, I could turn the heat on all day long, 24 hours a day, and it's not getting above 17 in there. Okay? It will not go above 17. Okay? But at the moment, nothing that we build displaces anything. None of the solar panels that we put up displaces anything. None of the wind turbines that we put up displaces anything. And so until we start displacing things, this won't happen. Brenda Boardman in Oxford wrote a book in which she talked about the need to knock down 60% of UK buildings and rebuild them. And from an engineering perspective, this made sense. What appeared in the Daily Mail in one of their typically reasoned arguments was, of course, the headline, Oxford professor recommends destruction of national heritage. That was it. Okay. Shall we do one more? Yeah, okay, you've got 30 seconds.
Just to follow up on this. So, would it help to replace just the windows of all Cambridge buildings by double glass? I mean, you don't have to tear them down, you can just change something, right? Or is it also not?
Okay, so I'll say a couple things about this. Number one, we have English heritage on Cambridge retrofit for a very real reason, which is that if they're not going to be behind what you're doing, you are not going to get this through. Although they do back off every once in a while, in the same way that in Trinity College Newcourt, English heritage, I think, did a very good job of saying, well, okay, we're not so pleased with what you're going to do in Newcourt, but we're willing to go forward with it. Number two, the energy efficiency of a building doesn't necessarily improve by tightening up the building. There are reasons that we have leaky buildings in the UK. Aside from the fact that I'll say we now, okay? We're rubbish at DIY. Okay, so I'm sorry, we are not the Germans when it comes to DIY. Okay, and as a result, we just don't fit things very well into their frames and so forth. So there are ways in which you could put in double glazed windows that wouldn't, in fact, deliver any of the savings that you're talking about. But also, we've got the problem that you will shut down the flow of air through a building, and if you live in a high damp country, if hypothetically England were a country that got a lot of rainfall, okay, this is problematic. It can become problematic, and you could easily find yourself, because of that dampness, you could find yourself having to run mechanical ventilation systems drawing off of coal-fired power plants somewhere in order to keep the damp from building up inside your house. So again, we could find ourselves in a hell with good intentions and desires. And as a result, we don't in Cambridge retrofit recommend double and triple glazing to every building. Okay? Only to some buildings. That's all I'll say. So get me out of here.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Professor.